The cold stone steps of the Grandwell Hotel pressed against Eli's thin legs, the chill seeping through his faded jeans. He sat hunched, his small frame making little impression on the vast marble steps. His backpack, weathered, worn, rested on the ground beside him, the only possession he had left in the world. The strap was frayed, the fabric torn from years of wear. Inside it there were only a few items that meant anything to him: 2 shirts, a worn notebook with dog-eared pages, and a photograph of his mother. The picture had once been crisp, the edges smooth, but now it was curled and faded. It was the only memory of her that remained untouched by time, taken before illness hollowed her cheeks and stole the spark from her eyes, before life became a series of hospital rooms and broken promises, till death finally claimed her. Eli's fingers lingered on the edges of the photo for a moment, tracing the outline of her smile, the smile he remembered before she had become a shadow of the woman he loved. Eli knew deep down that his mother would have never wanted this for him. She would have never wanted him to be sitting outside a place like the Grandwell Hotel, a monument to everything he couldn't touch, couldn't be. The kind of place that served cocktails in crystal glasses, that flaunted the wealth and power that made men like him invisible. He could see the guests inside through the glass doors, well-dressed women laughing behind shiny smiles, men who moved like they owned the world, their voices muffled by the thick glass. His stomach growled, a soft, hollow sound that reminded him of the emptiness that had followed him for the past few months. Since his mother's death, there had been little to fill the void she left. Food had become a luxury he rarely had access to. Sleep, too, was fitful, always interrupted by nightmares of his mother calling out to him from a hospital bed he couldn't reach. But he had learned to ignore these things as a boy like him had to. He was used to hunger, to sleeping on benches or beneath an awning when the rain came. But nothing, not even hunger, could match the gnawing emptiness he felt when he thought of how alone he truly was. He didn't look up as a shadow crossed the steps in front of him, though the presence was immediate, looming over him like a dark cloud. "I need you to pretend to be my son," a voice said, breaking through the quiet hum of the hotel's interior. Eli blinked, not sure if he had heard correctly. He glanced up, meeting the gaze of a man standing over him. The man's face was tight with anxiety, his eyes darting nervously toward the hotel doors, as if he feared someone might see him talking to Eli. The man's suit was impeccable, dark, sharp, the kind of outfit meant for someone who could afford anything. But his expression told a different story. It was one of desperation, the kind of desperation Eli knew well, the kind of desperation that came when you were willing to risk everything to avoid losing it all. "I'm sorry, what?" Eli asked, still sitting on the cold steps, not fully grasping what the man was saying. "I need you to pretend to be my son," the man repeated, this time with more urgency, "just for tonight." Eli blinked again, his mind struggling to piece together the words. A son? He had no idea what this man meant. Was he crazy? The man sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My name is Richard Halstead. I own this hotel, and a dozen others." He looked at Eli, his eyes wild now, desperate. "I'll pay you. More than you've ever seen." Eli laughed bitterly. "You can't buy a son." Richard's voice cracked, the weight of his desperation too heavy to ignore. "No, but I can't survive tonight without one." The words hung in the air. Eli's hesitation faltered just for a moment. Richard's eyes, dark and tired, searched his face as if pleading with him, not with money, but with something deeper, something broken. Eli's mind raced, conflicting thoughts spinning in his head. Hunger gnawed at him. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. He didn't know why this man had chosen him, but for the first time in a long while, someone was offering him something. Not charity, not pity, but something. Attention. Richard continued, his voice softer now. It's not just about me. I need them to believe my bloodline didn't end in failure. If the truth comes out, it'll destroy everything. Eli could feel the desperation in the air, thick like smoke. There was something more here, something hidden beneath Richard's words. This wasn't just about a lie, it was a matter of survival, but whose survival? Eli had no idea. But the thought of going back to his empty room in the alley, shivering alone in the cold, was enough to make him pause. He stared at Richard for a long moment, the weight of his own hunger and need pressing down on him like a physical thing. Just tonight, Richard added, the words hanging like a thin thread between them. Eli's mind raced, but his body, tired and worn, didn't hesitate. He nodded, almost without thinking. Just for tonight? Richard's gaze softened. Please, he added, just tonight. Eli looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. The man wasn't asking for a lot, not really. Only one night. One night to pretend. The words hung in the air. Eli's mind raced. He was used to people making promises they didn't keep. He had heard words like these before, from people who thought they could buy his dignity, his soul. But this man, this Richard Halstead, was different. There was no anger in his voice, no sense of entitlement. There was only fear. Eli hesitated. I don't want your money, he muttered, standing up and brushing the dust from his jeans. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but there was strength in it. You can't buy a son. Richard flinched, his expression tightening. No, he said, the words coming out softer this time, almost regretful. But I can't survive tonight without one. Eli frowned. His gaze flickered over the man in front of him, taking in his expensive suit, his well-polished shoes, the jittery way he moved. Richard Halstead didn't seem like the type of man to beg for anything. The desperation in his voice, though, felt real. Richard's eyes met Eli's. I just need them to believe that I'm not alone, he explained, his voice now a bare thread of desperation. That my bloodline didn't end in failure. Eli's thoughts ran in circles. His stomach growled again, louder this time, reminding him of the hollow ache inside him. And then there was the strange flicker of pity that twisted inside him. He had always been alone. He didn't know what it was like to have someone who cared. Eli could feel the desperation in the air, thick like smoke. There was something more here, something hidden beneath Richard's words. This wasn't just about a lie, it was a matter of survival. But whose survival? Eli had no idea, but the thought of going back to his empty room in the alley, shivering alone in the cold, was enough to make him pause. He stared at Richard for a long moment, the weight of his own hunger and need pressing down on him like a physical thing. Eli's mind raced, but his body, tired and worn, didn't hesitate. He nodded, almost without thinking. Just for tonight. Richard nodded, relief flooding his features. Just tonight, he repeated, and for a moment it almost felt like a promise. The room seemed to swell with silence as Richard and Eli entered together. The glittering chandeliers above cast a soft, golden glow over the crowd, the sharp contrast between the elegance of the ballroom and the worn edges of Eli's appearance striking and undeniable. Whispers rippled across the room like waves crashing into the shore. Eli could feel their eyes, cold and curious, turning toward him, eyes filled with suspicion, judgment, and curiosity. Eli's discomfort grew with each passing second, each gaze settling on him like a weight. The polished faces of the guests, adorned in finely tailored suits and glittering gowns, whispered behind their hands, their laughter more cold than friendly. He had never been in a place like this before, had never been under such intense scrutiny. The luxury around him made him feel like an alien, out of place, out of time, like something that didn't belong. He felt his throat tighten and his hands sweat, clenching the fabric of his jacket as if it could shield him from their eyes. He could hear snatches of conversation, fragments of words meant for others, but meant for him just the same. That's his son? I thought the boy was dead. He looks so young. Richard's hand rested possessively on his shoulder, as if trying to anchor him in the sea of judgment. Eli's body tensed under the touch, but he stayed still, pretending that nothing was wrong. Richard's voice rang out with forced confidence. "This is my son!" The crowd's reaction was a mixture of confusion and polite applause. The clapping was slow, unsure, but Eli felt it like 1,000 eyes boring into him. The polite gestures of wealth, the smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, they all felt like daggers in his chest. Margaret, Richard's sister, stood nearby, her pearls gleaming against her neck, as she gave Eli a cool smile. There was a sharpness in her gaze, a kind of polite interrogation that Eli could feel settling into the air between them. Her voice was sweet, but the questions were barbed. "You've been kept very private," she remarked, her tone light, but there was a note of skepticism underlying her words. "Why now?" Eli felt himself stiffen, unsure of how to answer. He could see the others nearby watching him, listening for the answers they were expecting. Richard had given him a story earlier about schooling abroad, about concerns for his safety. But it didn't feel true, not in the way he needed it to. Schools abroad, security concerns, Eli managed, the words tasting strange on his tongue. A desire for normalcy. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed. "You speak plainly," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. Not like the boys Richard usually raises. Eli's chest tightened. He had never been comfortable with the lies, the fabricated story that he didn't belong to. But the questions kept coming. The mocking laughter of a cousin echoed around them as another voice, sharp and pointed, chimed in. "What school did you say again?" the cousin asked, his tone thick with suspicion. What do you plan to study? Business? Law?" came the next question, this one tinged with a note of challenge, as if Eli's intelligence was being scrutinized by the crowd. Eli's mouth went dry. I like reading," he said, the words stumbling out in a rush. A moment of uncomfortable silence followed. He could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on him, and it felt like the walls were closing in. He was trying to be honest, but it was clear that honesty didn't fit here. The laughter, soft but unmistakable, cut deeper than any insult could. Eli wasn't acting like Richard's son. He wasn't playing the part they wanted him to play. Margaret's eyes flickered over him, a sudden glimmer of realization crossing her features. She leaned in closer, her eyes examining him with a sharper focus. "You have your mother's mark," she said quietly, her voice suddenly softer. Her gaze lingered on the scar on Eli's chin, a jagged line that ran across his face, a mark from the life he had left behind. Eli stiffened. The air between them suddenly charged, but he stayed silent. He couldn't speak the truth, not here, not now. Richard,
ever the protector, shifted between them. His hand tightened on Eli's shoulder, a possessive gesture that made Eli's skin crawl. Richard's voice was strained as he steered the conversation away, cutting the moment short. "This is my son," Richard said again, his smile forced, his tone tighter than before. The conversation moved on, but Eli could feel the distance growing. Richard's behavior had shifted. He was beginning to control the narrative more, answering questions for Eli, steering him through the ballroom like a puppet on a string. The night wore on, but the whispers, the questioning, and the scrutiny never stopped. Eli's stomach churned, the tightness in his chest never letting up. The stares,
The cold laughter, the way they looked at him, like something foreign, something to be questioned, it all piled up, pressing down on him with every passing moment. Finally, as the last of the guests filtered out, Richard led Eli down a quiet corridor, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. The hallway was dimly lit, far removed from the glittering ballroom. It felt like a different world, a world where Eli was no longer the center of attention, where Richard was no longer pretending. Richard stopped abruptly in the middle of the corridor, his hand dropping from Eli's shoulder. The suddenness of it felt like a slap. "That will be all," Richard said, his voice colder than before. Eli frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Sir?" "Our arrangement is finished," Richard replied, his words clipped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "Your payment," he said, handing it to Eli. Eli looked at the envelope, the harsh weight of Richard's words sinking in. "You said I needed an image." Richard cut him off, his gaze sweeping over Eli like he was something to be discarded. "I can never be a father to a smelly poor boy." The words struck deep, each syllable cutting through Eli like a knife. The sting of them lingered in the air, a sharp, bitter taste in his mouth. Richard had used him, and now he was discarding him like trash. "Leave," Richard added, his voice quieter now, almost dismissive. "Before anyone sees you." Eli turned, his heart heavy, and walked away. The envelope remained on the floor, abandoned just like he was. The weight of Richard's words followed him into the night. Eli walked back to the streets, his emotions in turmoil. He had never felt more alone, more rejected than he did now. The night that had started with such promise had ended in despair. And as he stepped back into the dark corners of the city, he realized that no matter how much he pretended, he would always be the boy no one cared about. Richard couldn't sleep. The darkness of the night seemed to mock him, echoing the turmoil that churned inside him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eli's face, the boy he had dismissed so easily. He could still feel the sting of his own words, the weight of the envelope in his hand, the cold finality of his rejection. It was as if the taint of his cruelty had followed him into the silence of his empty, sterile bed. His mind wouldn't shut off, his thoughts racing in endless loops,
each one more suffocating than the last. The praise and adoration he had received at the gala the night before felt hollow in his mind, empty words from empty people. He had been applauded for his graciousness, for his poise, for presenting the boy as his son. But now it felt like nothing more than a mask, a performance to hide his guilt, to hide the emptiness inside him. He had tried to escape his mistakes with wealth and status, but it wasn't enough. The guilt was seeping through, each moment more suffocating than the last. He had lied to himself, thinking he could keep everything under control. But now the weight of his failure was undeniable. He had turned Eli into a pawn, a tool for his own survival, and in doing so he had buried the truth deeper than he could ever imagine.
But the truth had a way of coming back, unseen, unnoticed, but undeniable. Margaret's visit caught Richard off guard. She arrived in the early morning, just as the remnants of night clung to the edges of his thoughts. Richard had been sitting at his desk, staring at nothing, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the envelope he had given to Eli. The silence in his office felt too loud, too heavy. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes sharp. "Where is your son?" Richard stiffened, his eyes darting to the window as if looking for an escape from her question. The previous night's events were still fresh in his mind, and he wasn't ready to confront the feelings of guilt and regret that were clawing at him. "Gone," he said dismissively, trying to keep his tone neutral. "It's finished." Margaret wasn't fooled. Her gaze narrowed, her sharp eyes dissecting him in a way no one else ever had. "Don't you see it?" she pressed, stepping further into the room, her presence commanding. "That boy carries his mother's mark." Richard froze. Margaret's words hit him like a jolt of electricity. The scar, the eyes, the silence. Slowly Margaret spoke, her voice cold, methodical. "He looks just like her. The scar on his chin, just like hers. The same eyes, the same silence." "He's your son, Richard." Richard's heart skipped a beat. The truth pierced through him like a shard of glass. He wanted to deny it, to push it away, but he couldn't. Not now. He knew, deep down, that Margaret was right. Eli was his son. The boy he had abandoned, the boy he had cast aside like an unwanted object, was his flesh and blood. He hadn't wanted to face it, hadn't wanted to acknowledge the mistakes he had made. But now, with Margaret's words hanging in the air, he couldn't run from the truth any longer. "I didn't know," Richard said, his voice a low murmur, more to himself than to Margaret. Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Some truths don't stay buried, Richard, no matter how hard you try to hide them." The search for Eli began with the same desperation that had plagued Richard since the moment he had dismissed him. Richard didn't know where to start. The boy had disappeared into the streets, back to the world he had come from, a world Richard had deliberately turned his back on. Richard wasn't used to this failure, the sense of powerlessness. It gnawed at him, and as the days passed, his obsession with finding Eli grew. He needed to fix this, to make things right, but the search only seemed to lead him in circles. He combed through shelters, spoke to anyone who might have seen the boy, visited soup kitchens where people like Eli congregated. Each day, it felt like he was getting further from the truth, chasing shadows and false leads. It was as if the city itself was swallowing Eli whole, hiding him from Richard's grasp. Richard found Eli's backpack first, abandoned on a bench in an alley. He could hardly breathe when he saw it. The straps were frayed, the fabric worn, the same backpack Eli had carried when they met. Richard reached down and picked it up, his fingers trembling as he unzipped it. Inside were the 2 shirts, the worn notebook, and the photo of Eli's mother.
But there was no Eli. He didn't stop looking, though, not even when his body ached from exhaustion, not even when the weight of his guilt threatened to consume him. Then finally, on the 5th day, Richard found him. Eli was working in a small, forgotten corner of the city, laboring under the harsh sun, clearing weeds from a garden that no one cared for. The boy's clothes were dirty, his face streaked with sweat, but there was no mistaking him. Richard's heart stopped when he saw him. Eli, Richard said, his voice breaking the silence. Eli turned, his eyes guarded, unreadable. The boy's body stiffened, but he didn't move away. Richard approached slowly, his hands trembling. The role reversal was too stark. Richard, the wealthy man who had everything, now standing powerless before Eli. The boy who had nothing.
"Who was your mother?" Richard asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Eli's eyes flashed for just a moment, a flicker of pain behind them. "Sarah Carter," he said quietly, the name hanging in the air like a weight. Richard's heart shattered. Sarah Carter. The name he had buried so deep in his past, the woman he had abandoned for his own selfish reasons. The realization struck him harder than anything before. Eli was his son, and he had never seen it. He had rejected his own flesh and blood. The envelope sat on Richard's desk, its contents undeniable. The DNA test results, finally confirmed, stared up at him in stark black and white 99.9% match. The boy he had cast aside, the boy he had used and abandoned, was his son. The truth could no longer be ignored. Richard had spent his life running from it, but now it stood before him, undeniable. Richard couldn't breathe. The weight of the paper was suffocating, but it wasn't just the physical weight. It was the emotional weight of what it meant. His hands trembled as he stared at the result, trying to reconcile what he had always known with what was now undeniable. Eli was his son, flesh and blood. The boy he had abandoned, the boy he had cast aside without a second thought, was his own. He dropped the envelope onto the desk, his chest tightening. His heart felt like it was lodged somewhere in his throat, unable to escape. He had lied to himself for so long, told himself he was too busy, too powerful, too important to be a father, that it didn't matter. But now, here it was, the truth that he had run from for years. The truth that he couldn't hide from any longer. But now, as the truth laid bare before him, all Richard could do was sit in the ruins of his own decisions. Richard fell to his knees. The floor felt cold beneath him, but it was nothing compared to the cold inside him. Guilt and regret tore through him like a violent storm. His vision blurred, and he realized with a sickening clarity that all the power, all the money couldn't fix this. It couldn't fix what he had done to Eli, to Sarah, to the boy who was now standing just outside the walls of his company in a world of poverty that Richard had never even cared to notice. He was a father, and he had been too blind, too proud to see it. Eli had been right all along. The boy had never needed him, not in the way Richard thought. Richard had been the one who had needed Eli to fix what he had broken, to redeem himself. But now that chance seemed so far out of reach. Eli's face was a mask of quiet anger when Richard finally found him. The day had been long, the search grueling, but nothing felt as heavy as the weight of their first conversation after the truth had been revealed. Eli didn't need Richard's redemption. He didn't need his pity, his money, or his blood. "I found you," Richard said, his voice hoarse, breaking under the weight of his own guilt. Eli didn't respond immediately. He didn't move or react in the way Richard expected. The boy stood there, silent, his face carefully neutral, but Richard could see it, the tightness in his posture, the way his jaw clenched when Richard spoke. "I was wrong," Richard said, his voice cracking.
"I've made mistakes, more than I can ever make up for, but I'm here now. I'm here for you." Eli's eyes flashed with quiet rage. His voice was low but steady when he finally spoke. "You don't get to be my father now." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't process. His mind reeled, trying to understand. How could Eli say that? How could his son reject him so easily? Eli took a step closer, his voice even more filled with bitterness than before. You don't get to be my father just because you found out I'm yours. You don't get to redeem yourself with a DNA test. That's not how it works. Richard felt the weight of those words, and for the first time, the truth about what he had done to Eli became too much to bear.
This wasn't about fixing things with money or status. It wasn't about the truth of blood. It was about the years he had wasted, the years he had ignored Eli and his mother, Sarah, who had died alone, abandoned by him. Eli didn't need a father who was afraid of responsibility. He didn't need a father who was just going to show up when it suited him. Eli wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for accountability. "You left my mother to die," Eli said, his voice cold but cutting through Richard's guilt like a knife. "I watched her waste away. I watched her struggle while you threw your money around and pretended that you didn't have time for me. She was all I had, and you didn't care." Richard's chest tightened. The words were so simple, but they stung in ways that words shouldn't. The truth about Sarah, the truth about his neglect, was too painful to face, but Eli had lived it. "I'm sorry," Richard whispered, the apology weak and almost meaningless against the years of abandonment. He wanted to fix it, wanted to make things right, but how could he after everything he had done? Eli shook his head slowly. "Sorry doesn't fix anything. Sorry doesn't bring back what you took from me." His voice was steady, but the anger in it was undeniable. "You can't just buy back what you lost, Richard. You can't fix what you've broken." There was silence between them for a long moment, but Eli didn't waver. He stood tall, his eyes unwavering. "If you want me to accept you," Eli said, his voice now filled with a quiet demand, "you need to build something that helps children like me. Widows and wounded women like my mother. You need to create something that lasts longer than your wealth, something that shows you're capable of more than just taking." Richard's heart ached. Eli's words were both a demand and a plea, a hope that Richard would do what he had never done before, take responsibility, not just for Eli, but for everyone he had failed. Eli didn't want money or a father who only existed because of guilt. He wanted justice. He wanted Richard to build something that would help the people he had ignored, the people who had lived in the margins of Richard's empire. Richard didn't know what to say. How could he offer more than just empty promises? But there was one thing he could do. "I will," Richard said, the words almost a vow. "I swear to you, I will." He knelt before Eli, not in pride, but in humility, something he had never done before. He had spent so many years running from responsibility, thinking he could get by without paying the price for his actions. But now, with Eli standing before him, the only way to earn his forgiveness was to change. "I'll create it," Richard promised. "I'll create the Sarah Carter Foundation, for children like you, for wounded women, in her name." 6 months later, the Sarah Carter Foundation opened its doors. It wasn't much at first, just a small shelter, a few programs, but it was a start. Richard's wealth had gone towards something that mattered, something that would make a difference in people's lives. Eli wasn't involved directly. He didn't need to be, but he knew it was a step toward healing. Richard's legacy would no longer be about his empire, about his status, or his wealth. It would be about the son he had failed and the work he had done to change the lives of others. Eli, for the first time in his life, didn't have to pretend anymore. He was no longer the boy on the cold steps. Richard watched him go, a quiet acknowledgement in his eyes. Fatherhood earned, not purchased. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster of a story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Your support helps us bring more compelling stories to life. Now here's a question for you. Do you think Richard truly redeemed himself by creating the Sarah Carter Foundation? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this moral dilemma. Drop your comments below and let's get the conversation started. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.